Good morning. My name is Michel. Mon nom est Michel. I am a member now of the Outreach Committee. And this morning, we are reading the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, 31 to 40. When the Son of Man comes in his glories, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food, and I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you take care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and give you food, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and give you clothing? And when, what is that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." In this reading, we hear the word of wisdom of our teacher and Redeemer.
It's my privilege to introduce to you, or reintroduce to you, Henry Reinders. Henry Reinders is the regional representative for all of Ontario, Eastern Ontario?
All of Ontario.
All of Ontario.
And Quebec.
And Quebec, holy moly. For the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. And Henry was here last year. The Canadian Foodgrains Bank is a charity, a mission in Canada. Well, Henry's going to talk about it, so I don't need to explain it. But it's one that's near and dear to our heart at Wall Street as an organization that feeds the hungry around the world, and it has a number of different church denominations involved in it. Henry has an agricultural background, both in academics, having studied agriculture, but also took on his parents' dairy farm and farmed for quite a while before deciding to retire. And I don't think dust settles on you very much in your retirement. Henry continues to be very active with the Foodgrains Bank, as well as you're a trustee and board member active at Knox Presbyterian in Meaford, Ontario, and has a couple hobbies. I think you could have brought your cool car with you. There's a Netflix romance movie being filmed that has all these cool old cars, and I think yours would have fit in just perfectly with it. Anyway, we are very honored that you're here to speak with us again, Henry. So we are so grateful for that. And I'll let you know a little bit more about how we can support this cause after the service. But for now, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kim. Well, it is really wonderful to be with you folks again, and I meet lots and lots of people, and I forget names, so if I've met you and I've forgotten your name, please reintroduce yourself. But I see a lot of familiar faces that I met a year ago, so it's really wonderful to be back with you. Delighted to see all the red aprons that are out here saying Canadian Foodgrains Bank, so I know something special is going on afterwards as well, and I'm sure that we'll hear more about that as the service comes to an end. Anyway, this past year was our 40th anniversary of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, and I had the opportunity with the celebrations that we had across the province to be out with our executive director, Andy Harrington, for a number of days. And Andy's been in the humanitarian field for over 30 years, and he brings a lot of experience to the table. He's very down to earth, he's very humble, and like all of us at Canadian Foodgrains Bank, he's 100% dedicated to the cause of ending global hunger. So I want to share some of his thoughts that I learned from him while we were together on that day as well. So let's start with the next slide. So the mission of Canadian Foodgrains Bank is working to end global hunger, and our vision, of course, is a world without hunger. And you all knew this, so I've told you this last year, but I think it's good to review that and keep that in the forefront of what we're doing. We're rooted in the belief that all of humankind is made in God's image, and as such, God does not want to see his people suffering. Next slide. So the Foodgrains Bank is made up of 15 churches and church-based agencies working together on this single mission. And all of them are shown here on this particular slide. Now, I was asked earlier this morning, does the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church participate in that? Because you don't see them listed there, but in fact they are. PWRDF, which is Primates World Relief and Development, is the Anglican Church. DNP, Caritas Canada, is the Catholic Church that are involved with Foodgrains Bank. So virtually all of these, there are 15 churches and church-based agencies representing about 30 denominations. So it's a huge coverage across Canada of all the folks that are working together with the Foodgrains Bank. And that's the great strength that we have as an organization, is that we are all working together on this one mission of feeding people. Next slide. As I mentioned, the Foodgrains Bank is 40 years old, or we're into our 41st year now, and it started back in the mid to late 70s with the Mennonite Central Committee, who recognized that there was a need for food aid in places like Ethiopia and Bangladesh, where starvation was becoming a real issue. And at the same time in those years, Canadian farmers were having bumper crops in Manitoba and in the western provinces. And so, taking a look at that, the Mennonite Central Committee wondered, how can we make this equal so that we can start to help some of the people who are suffering from starvation? And they proposed the formation of the Mennonite Canada Food Bank. And so that was put together. The next slide. So the Mennonite Central Committee Food Bank was created, and donated grain was taken from farmers who were donated, and some of it was purchased, and eventually it was bagged off and sent overseas to the countries where this help was needed. At the same time, the Canadian government became involved with this through matching funds through their Canadian International Development Agency. And that 4-to-1 match that many of you have heard about started with this program way back 40 years ago, and it's still in place today, where donations are eligible to be matched up to 4-to-1, up to a maximum of $25 million a year. So not everything, because of our growth and the fact that we're raising more funds than we did in those earlier years, not everything is matched 4-to-1, but it's still a pretty significant amount of money that we get supported from the Canadian government. So the Mennonite Central Committee started to ship food overseas. Next slide. And at the same time, they asked other churches to become involved with that. And so there are 5 churches listed on that slide. The Mennonite Central Committee is one of those that started the Foodgrains Bank in 1983, and that's how our origins began. I always tell people, and I'm sure I said this last year too, the difference between the Foodgrains Bank today and what we started out as is that we no longer ship food aid from Canada. All of the food that is grown here through our growing projects is sold, the proceeds come to the Foodgrains Bank, and then through our members and their partners, food is purchased locally in the countries where we're working to help feed the people over there that need to be helped. Next slide. So, over our 40-year history, we have provided $1.15 billion of assistance through more than 2,150 projects in over 80 countries around the world. So we have been, as the song says, I've been everywhere, man. We have been in a lot of locations around the world doing this kind of work. Now, as the Ontario Regional Representative, I like to visit donors across the province, and I recently visited with a long-term donor who suddenly stopped. She was a major donor, and she suddenly wasn't giving anymore. And I called in on her to see what was going on, and she told me that she didn't think her donations were making a difference. In fact, all of the organizations doing this kind of work around the world really were having no impact. She said, just look at the numbers. They continue to increase, and we're not making a difference. Next slide. And while I was saddened, it is true in what she was saying, because we are seeing the numbers of hungry people in the world increasing. Back in about 6 or 7, 8 years ago, we got as low as 600 million people in the world who didn't have enough to eat. But the latest report from the United Nations now says there are over 783 million people who don't have enough to eat, who are chronically hungry. The COVID pandemic alone caused 122 million more people to have hunger issues, and that was caused because they lost their jobs, they lost their income, food prices escalated, and so more and more people couldn't afford to buy the food that they needed. So economic disruptions caused by events like the COVID pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine, where Ukraine and Russia supply the major portion of food for about 50 African countries. That supply has been hampered because of the war that's going on. Prices have risen, and again, you have more and more people who are suffering from hunger because of that. So economic disruptions have been a major part in the last number of years of causing increasing levels of hunger. But it's not just these economic disruptions. War and conflict driving people from their home and their land, climate change resulting in storms that wipe out crops, or droughts that last an unprecedented 5 or 6 years now in the Horn of Africa. Those are all situations that are resulting in more and more people being hungry. 783 million people in the world are chronically hungry. And that's not the I missed breakfast or that I wish I had a little bit of food to eat, I need a granola bar type of hunger. It's that gnawing, aching pang of not having enough food at all. It's the hunger that has put 40 million people into famine, 40 million people who are facing starvation. And that's the hunger that results in 1 in 5 children in the world being malnourished. Next slide. Let me ask you a question. Do you think we can end global hunger? Sadly, I think the answer is no. Certainly not in my lifetime. We're not living in the easiest of times. You only have to listen to the news, if you can even stand listening to it, to realize that the situation around the world in many locations is very, very difficult. We've become immune, almost apathetic toward what has been going on in Syria over the last decade. Even the war in Ukraine seems to have become old news. And now we have the atrocities in Israel and Gaza dominating our news. Next slide. Somebody asked me in an email if I could touch a little bit about what's going on in Gaza. And so this slide illustrates some of the statistics of what's happening there. In our 40-year history as Canadian Foodgrains Bank, this is the worst crisis that we have ever faced. 2.2 million people in Gaza. Of those 2.2 million people, fully 50% are facing starvation. It's a very, very serious, almost depressing, well, it is a depressing issue. And so it's been ongoing now for several months, and there doesn't appear to be an end in sight, although I hear some talk about a ceasefire possibly happening. So, do we just quit? Do we just walk away? Just think about the situation in reverse for a moment. How would you feel if you were running for your life? If you were living in a bombed-out building, a refugee camp, or just simply in the middle of nowhere because you had nowhere to go? Would you feel abandoned, forgotten, ignored? It's enough to make you shout, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that's how it becomes for people in these situations. The world wants to say God has forgotten you and we don't care. You don't matter. But as Christians, we simply cannot accept that. We must show the opposite because that is what being a Christian is all about. We need to show this not only in what we say, but in what we do. It goes back to the verses we read this morning. "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." And when we ask, "When did we do these things for you, Lord?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Our 15 members, and that is you, our partners, our donors, our growing project people, our staff prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that we do care and that God cares. You, we work together to take care of the least of these brothers and sisters. Psalm 68, verse 5 says, "He is a father to the fatherless and a defender of the widows." God is with the orphans. God is with the widows. God is with the poor, the destitute, the brokenhearted, the hungry. He's with the people fleeing the bombs. He's with the people hiding in shelters. He's with the people living in refugee camps. He does care, and that is why we do what we do. The Bible tells us also in Luke 12, verse 7, that God knows the number of hairs on our head, and that we are worth more than many sparrows. He knows each and every individual on this planet, no matter their circumstances, and no matter where they are. He knows because he cares, and because, unlike the world, he does not forget. And we don't forget either. Next slide. What are we doing in Gaza? We do have programs there, and we're helping out as best we can. We're helping out through Mennonite Central Committee, who is one of our members, and Development and Peace, Caritas Canada, who's the Catholic arm, the mission arm. And they are moving forward as best they can with programming. They have purchased food in Jordan, programming enough to reach about 21,000 people. The difficulty has been getting it into the country. There are so many checks and balances in place that it's been very difficult to get trucks through. The earlier slide said we're getting about 200, up to 200 trucks a day now going into Gaza, where they need 500. And as I understand it, there's enough food around the whole of Gaza to feed everybody. It's just not getting in there. So it's still a very, very critical situation. Next slide. Let me tell you the story about a couple of other people that the world may have forgotten, but who God remembers, and who we remember. Gaitha is a woman in Ethiopia that Andy met at a food distribution site. As they sat on a dusty stone wall, Gaitha told them how they hadn't seen rain in years. Then suddenly a rainstorm developed over the countryside, and the hills around them were flooded, and the water flowed down into the valley and flowed through the valley and wiped out her village. In fact, it wiped out 4 villages. The ground was so dry and hard it couldn't absorb any water, and as it rushed through, it took their homes with them. They lost what little they had. She told how she had to make a decision each day on which of her 4 children would get something to eat. Can you imagine that? Having to decide which of your kids is going to get something to eat that day? And I'm not talking about a plate full of food. This is a meager handful. That's enough to keep somebody alive. With the Foodgrains Bank programming in her area, she was able to get food assistance in the form of an allotment of beans and maize and oil, enough to keep her family going. And that's the work that we do. That's the work you support. Work that saves lives. As they talked, she broke out into song. Her gratefulness was undeniable. She had so little, and yet she had so much. She had food to feed her children, food to keep them alive. And with God's help, she said, she felt they could get back on their feet and once again grow their own food if the rains would keep coming. Next slide. Asnikech Zima learned the principles of conservation agriculture through Terrapeza Development Association, who is a partner of Foodgrains Bank member Tier Fund Canada. Her corn yields increased from 50 kilograms to 550 kilograms on a small 20 by 30 meter plot that her husband allowed her to use for this silly way of farming. See, that's one of the things we run into when we're doing this work in many of these countries. Women have so little to say, and yet they're the ones that are going out and learning how to use these techniques. And when they come back to the farm, the husband often says, that'll never work. What we're doing now doesn't work. How is that going to work? Go back to the back 40, or in this case, the back 20 by 30 plot. Try it out there. And what happens is they're so successful, as Asnikech was, that the husbands come around and say, wow, this is amazing. And they start to incorporate that across all of their land. And so in Asnikech's case, her husband became supportive of what she's doing. They now work together as a team, and they have been able to become food secure in their own requirements. Next slide. But Asnikech's story doesn't stop there. The failed rainy seasons in Ethiopia caught up with her, and her crops started to fail as well. But her training had taught her resilience, and she found more drought-tolerant crops that she could provide for her family. It wasn't as much as before, and she had to sell off her livestock to make ends meet, but she was still able to provide enough for her family. And that's something she learned through the training that she got. So going back to the original question. Oh, next slide, sorry. Today, her crops are again starting to thrive as the rains have returned, and she is rebuilding her farm, buying back livestock, and again feeling secure about her future. Going back to the original question, are we making a difference? Next slide. The answer is yes. We made a difference in Regatha, we made a difference for Asnaketch, and last year we made a difference for over 1.1 million people in 36 countries around the world. Our donors, our growing projects, our members, our government provided us with $79.8 million to make a difference, to save lives. When you look at the big picture, we can get lost in the numbers. 783 million people chronically hungry, 40 million people facing starvation, millions upon millions displaced by war. This is a world where we talk about those others, or those people. We objectify them. They are less than people. They are objects. They are different from us. And because of that, we treat them differently. And all through history, the trail of destruction starts with those people. It divides countries, and it's happening right now in Gaza and Israel. But this is not the way of Jesus. There is no other, no those people. Every single person on this earth is made in the image of God. That's the person fleeing the bombs in Gaza, hiding from the terrorists in Israel, the person existing in a refugee camp, or living in a Manhattan penthouse. That's you and me. Next slide. Romeo Dallaire, leader of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during the genocide, said, "All humans are human. Not one of us is any more human than the other." And so we need to look beyond the big picture and the big numbers to the individuals, to the Gaithas and the Asnaketches of this world. We need to consider each human being as a person to remember, as a life worth saving, and as a creation of God. You and I are that creation, and we are no more or less valuable in God's eyes than Gaitha or Asnaketch. We're all precious in His sight. It reminds me of a story you may have heard before. Next slide. A young boy was walking along a beach covered with hundreds and hundreds of stranded starfish. As he walked, he would bend over, picking up a starfish and throw it back into the water. An elderly gentleman watched as the boy approached, and as he came closer, he again reached down and threw another one of the stranded creatures into the ocean. "Son," said the gentleman, "why do you bother? There are so many, it's not going to make a difference." "Perhaps not," replied the boy as he tossed the starfish into the sea, "but it did make a difference to that one." We know we can't feed 783 million people. But if we start with one and keep going, we know we can do 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, even 1,000,000 people. And as long as we have God working through us and the resources and the support provided to us, we will continue to feed the hungry until all are fed. I'm asking you today to help in that work. And how do you do that? Next slide. And I've gone over this with you last year. You can give. I'm leaving some envelopes downstairs, but we've got this event happening afterwards that'll allow you to give. There's resources down there to help you learn about the Foodgrains Bank, and our website at foodgrainsbank.ca is a great resource as well. And pray. Pray without ceasing. Prayer is so important. And finally, advocating. Next slide. You can advocate by talking to your members of parliament. And next slide, you can advocate by the social media posts that we have, by liking them. That spreads the word at the Foodgrains Bank. So together we can make a difference. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I appreciate being able to come here and speak with you, and I look forward to meeting with many of you again after the service today.